kind old black lady shelters 20 Hell's Angels during a snowstorm. Next day 100 bikes line up at her door. The cold was a thief. It stole the warmth from Alara Mae Thompson's bones, the heat from her little diner, and the last vestiges of hope from her heart. Outside, the world had vanished into a blinding fury of white. The blizzard had descended upon the small, isolated town of Havenwood without mercy, burying roads, snapping power lines, and silencing the world under a thick blanket of snow. Inside the hearth, the diner that was her life's work and her late husband's legacy. The only light came from a few flickering emergency candles and the weak, battery-powered lantern on the counter. The silence was broken only by the howl of the wind and the rattling of the window panes, a sound like skeletal fingers drumming for entry. Alara sat in a worn vinyl booth, her hands wrapped around a mug of lukewarm water. She was 72 years old, a woman whose grace had been etched by hardship, whose skin held the stories of a life lived with more love than money. Her husband, Marcus, had been gone for 5 years to the day, and the anniversary felt as raw and biting as the wind outside. He had poured his soul into this diner, believing it could be a place of welcome for all, a warm spot in a town that wasn't always warm to people who looked like them. But since he'd passed, the diner had been dying a slow, quiet death. The regulars had dwindled, the bills had piled up like snowdrifts, and Mr. Gable, the man who owned the building, had a heart as cold as the January ground. The final eviction notice sat on the counter, its stark black letters a final, cruel judgment. She had until tomorrow. Her gaze drifted to the single pot simmering on the gas stove in the back. A simple beef and vegetable stew. It was all she had left. Enough for her dinner tonight, and maybe a small breakfast tomorrow before she had to face the inevitable. The thought of leaving this place, of losing the last tangible piece of Marcus, was a physical ache in her chest. She looked at his photograph on the wall, a handsome young man in his army uniform, his smile so full of life and promise. "Oh, Marcus," she whispered into the cold air, her breath a small white cloud. "What am I going to do?" It was then that a new sound cut through the storm's lament. A low, guttural rumble, deep and menacing. It grew louder, a mechanical chorus that seemed to vibrate up through the floorboards. It was the sound of engines, many of them, laboring against the snow. Alara's heart seized. No one should be out in this. The state troopers had closed the highway hours ago. She moved cautiously to the front window, wiping a small circle of condensation from the glass. Through the swirling snow, she saw them. Headlights cut through the gloom, illuminating a line of massive motorcycles parked haphazardly in front of her diner. The machines were dusted with snow, their chrome glinting dully in the lantern light. And then she saw the men. They were giants, clad in thick, patched leather, their faces obscured by beards and the cold. There must have been 20 of them, dismounting their bikes and stamping their feet, their forms like hulking shadows in the blizzard. On their backs was an insignia she didn't recognize, but the implication was clear. They were a motorcycle club, the kind of men mothers warned their children about, the kind of men Havenwood's polite society shunned and feared. The diner door burst open with a gust of frigid air and a flurry of snow, extinguishing 2 of her precious candles. The men filed in, bringing the storm with them. They filled the small space, their sheer size making the room shrink. They were loud and imposing, their leather creaking, their boots thumping on the linoleum. The air grew thick with the scent of cold metal, wet leather, and exhaustion. Alara stood frozen behind the counter, her knuckles white where she gripped its edge. This was it. This was the end of everything. A robbery or worse. Her mind, already frayed with despair, braced for the final blow. The men fell silent as one, their eyes adjusting to the dim light. They looked at her, this small, lone black woman standing her ground in a dying diner. A man detached himself from the group. He was the largest of them all, with a great graying beard that covered half his chest and shoulders as broad as the diner's door. A long scar cut across his left eyebrow, giving him a permanent look of fierce appraisal. He took off his thick gloves, revealing hands that were calloused and scarred, and walked slowly toward the counter. The others watched, silent and unmoving. He stopped a few feet from her, his eyes, surprisingly clear and intelligent, meeting hers. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low rumble like distant thunder. "Forgive the intrusion. Our bikes can't make it any further in this. The highway's a death trap. We saw your light. We're just looking for a place to get out of the storm. Just until it breaks." Alara's mind raced. Fear was a cold knot in her stomach. The town's prejudice was a palpable force. She knew what they would say if they knew she'd let these men in. Mr. Gable would have a field day, painting her as a harborer of criminals. Another reason to cast her out. Every instinct for self-preservation screamed at her to say no, to tell them to leave, to bolt the door and pray they didn't break it down. It was the logical thing to do. It was the safe thing to do. But then she looked past the intimidating leather, past the grim, road-worn faces. She saw the way the snow clung to their beards, the red, chapped skin on their cheeks, the exhaustion that pulled at the corners of their eyes. They weren't monsters. They were just men, cold and stranded and in need of shelter. They were human beings caught in the same storm that was battering her own soul. Marcus's voice echoed in her memory, a warm and steady presence. "Kindness costs nothing, Alara," he used to say, his hand covering hers. "But its value is infinite. You don't measure a person by the clothes they wear or the whispers of others. You measure them by the need in their eyes." She looked at the leader, this mountain of a man who had addressed her with respect, who had called her ma'am. She saw the need in his eyes. In that moment, the fear receded, replaced by a quiet, steely resolve that had carried her through a lifetime of quiet battles. Her reputation in this town was already in tatters. Her diner was already lost. What more did she have to lose? Her own humanity? No, she would not lose that. She straightened her shoulders, a small, dignified motion that seemed to fill the room with a sudden authority. "The storm shows no favorites," she said, her voice clear and steady, betraying none of the terror she'd felt moments before. "And neither does this diner. Come in, all of you. Get warm." A collective sigh of relief seemed to pass through the men. The tension in the room broke. The leader gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod of gratitude. "Thank you, ma'am. We won't cause you any trouble." "Trouble has already found me," Alara replied with a wry, sad smile. "A little more company won't make much difference," she gestured to the booths. "Seat, please." The bikers moved with a surprising quietness, shuffling into the booths, their large frames crammed into the small spaces. They were respectful of their surroundings, taking care not to knock over the salt and pepper shakers, their movements suddenly careful and deliberate. Alara turned to the stove. The stew. It was all she had. It wasn't enough for 20 hungry men, not by a long shot. It was barely enough for one old woman. But it was what she had to give. Without a second thought, she took the ladle and began searching for bowls. She would give them her last meal. It was a simple choice, made in the heart of her own private blizzard. She would meet the coldness of the world with the only weapon she had left, a stubborn, unwavering warmth. The men watched as Alara moved about her small kitchen, her actions efficient and graceful. She found every bowl she owned, a mismatched collection of ceramic and porcelain, and began to ladle out the stew. It was a meager portion for each man, barely enough to cover the bottom of the bowl, but she divided it with the careful precision of a mother ensuring each child got their fair share. She brought the bowls out on trays, setting one before each man. The rich, savory scent of the stew filled the cold air, a welcome ghost of warmth and home. The bikers, who had been boisterous and loud outside, were now completely silent. They looked down at the small offering, then back at her. No one moved to eat. The leader, who had taken a seat in the booth nearest the counter, looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Ma'am," he said again, his voice soft, "is this your own dinner?" Alara simply nodded, placing a bowl in front of him. A meal tastes better when it's shared. He held her gaze for a long moment, and in his eyes, she saw something shift. The hard, protective shell seemed to crack just a little, revealing a profound respect. He picked up his spoon. "Then we're honored to share it with you," he said. He took a bite, and only then did the other men begin to eat. They ate slowly, savoring each spoonful as if it were a banquet. When they were finished, the bowls were so clean they hardly needed washing. A quiet camaraderie settled over the diner. Some of the men dozed in the booths, their heads resting on their arms. Others spoke in low murmurs, their conversations hushed and respectful. Illyra poured them coffee, stretching the last of her grounds as far as they would go. The leader hadn't taken his eyes off her. He gestured to the photograph on the wall. "That man," he said, his voice a low rumble. "He a family member." "My husband," Illyra said, her voice catching slightly. "Marcus. He passed 5 years ago. Today is the anniversary." The big man nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the smiling young soldier in the picture. "He was a soldier, it wasn't a question." "Yes, served 2 tours. He was a good man, the best I ever knew. This diner." This was his dream. Her words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken grief and failure. "My name is Ben," the leader said, surprising her by offering a name instead of a road handle. "But most folks call me Grizz." He looked back at the photo. "We're on our way to bury a brother. Name was Cutter. He was a vet too. The storm caught us outside Flagstaff. We were trying to get him home to his family for a proper burial. Suddenly, these weren't just intimidating figures in leather. They were men on a solemn journey. They were grieving. They were honoring one of their own." Illyra saw a reflection of her own sorrow in their quest. They were bound by a code of loyalty she was beginning to understand, a code that ran deeper than their fearsome appearance. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said, and she meant it. The sentiment forged a fragile bridge between them, a shared understanding of what it meant to lose someone you loved. Grizz looked around the cold, dim diner. He saw the peeling paint, the worn-out counter, the eviction notice she hadn't bothered to hide. He saw the quiet dignity in her posture and the deep weariness in her eyes. He didn't say anything, but his gaze was heavy with a dawning comprehension. He and his men stayed through the night, sleeping in shifts in the booths. They were quiet, unobtrusive guests. For the first time in a long time, Illyra didn't feel entirely alone in the darkness. She felt safe. The very men the town would have condemned as a threat had become her silent guardians against the storm. The first gray light of dawn crept through the windows, revealing a world transformed. The blizzard had broken, leaving behind a pristine, silent landscape of deep snow. The sky was a pale, clear blue. Inside the diner, the bikers were stirring, stretching their stiff limbs. They began to clean up, wiping down the tables, stacking their empty coffee mugs neatly by the sink, moving with an unspoken efficiency. Grizz approached the counter where Illyra was standing. He pulled a thick roll of cash from his jacket pocket. "Ma'am, we need to settle up for the food and the lodging." Illyra shook her head, pushing his hand away gently.
"No."
"You were my guests. There's no charge for shelter from a storm." Grizz looked at her, his expression serious. "We always pay our debts, ma'am. Always. Then pay it forward," she said softly. "Be kind to the next soul you find in need. That will be payment enough for me." He stared at her for a moment, then slowly nodded, a flicker of deep admiration in his eyes. He put the money away. "That's a debt we'll be honored to repay." The men began to file out, each one stopping to nod or murmur a quiet "thank you, ma'am" as they passed. Their gratitude was sincere, a stark contrast to the contempt she so often received from the more respectable citizens of Havenwood. As the last of them stepped outside into the bright, cold morning, Illyra felt a pang of loneliness. Their presence, which had initially been a source of terror, had become a strange comfort. Just as the last motorcycle engine roared to life, a sleek black car slid to a halt behind them, its tires crunching on the fresh snow. Mr. Gable stepped out, his face a mask of smug fury. He was a small, pinched man whose expensive overcoat couldn't hide the pettiness of his soul. He took in the scene, the 20 bikers, the steam rising from their exhaust pipes, and Alara standing in the doorway of her diner, and his lips curled into a sneer. He waited until the last of the bikes had rumbled away down the street before he marched up to her, his polished shoes sinking into the snow. "Well, well, Alara," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Entertaining vermin now, are we? I knew you were desperate, but I didn't think you'd sink to harboring a criminal gang." "They were just men seeking shelter from the storm, Mr. Gable," Alara said, her voice tired but firm. "I don't care what they were," he snapped, his face reddening with anger. "Their presence here violates a dozen clauses in your lease agreement." "Not that it matters," he thrust a folded piece of paper at her. It was the same notice as before, but this time it felt colder, sharper. "This is your final warning. The 24 hours I gave you are almost up. I want my money, all of it, by noon, or I'll have Sheriff Peters drag you and your belongings into the street. And after this little stunt, believe me, he won't be sympathetic." He didn't wait for a reply. He spun on his heel and marched back to his car, leaving Alara standing alone in the doorway, the cold of his words seeping into her deeper than the morning air. The brief warmth of the night, the flicker of hope she'd felt, was extinguished. The reality of her situation came crashing back down, heavier and more hopeless than before. Her act of kindness, it seemed, was going to be the final nail in her coffin. The hours that followed passed in a haze of quiet despair. Alara moved through the diner like a ghost, her heart a leaden weight in her chest. The world outside was bright and beautiful, the snow sparkling under the brilliant sun, but inside the hearth, the shadows were longer than ever. She knew there was no way to get the money. She had nothing left to sell, no one left to ask. It was over. She began to pack, her movements slow and methodical. There wasn't much. A few changes of clothes, a handful of kitchen utensils she couldn't bear to part with, and the precious few mementos of her life with Marcus. She took his photograph down from the wall, her fingers tracing the outline of his smiling face. She packed it carefully in a small wooden box, along with his 2 service medals and the worn leather-bound Bible he used to read from every night. As she was wrapping the Bible, her fingers brushed against something hard at the bottom of the box. It was Marcus's old army knife. It was a simple, functional tool, but he had carried it with him through 2 tours of duty. He'd once told her it had saved his life more than once. The wooden handle was worn smooth from use, and on one side, he had painstakingly carved the insignia of his unit, a striking eagle with a lightning bolt in its talons. She held the knife in her palm, its weight a small, solid comfort. It was a symbol of his strength, his resilience, a piece of the man who never gave up. She closed her hand around it, drawing a sliver of his courage into herself. A soft knock at the door made her jump. She thought it was Gable, returned early to gloat. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she went to the door and peered through the glass. It wasn't Gable. It was one of the bikers from the night before, a younger one with dark, serious eyes. He was alone. Cautiously, she opened the door. "Ma'am," he said, holding up a pair of leather gloves. "Sorry to bother you. I think I left these here last night." "Oh, of course, come in," Alara said, stepping back. The young man, who looked to be no older than her own grandson would have been, stepped inside. His eyes scanned the room, taking in the packing boxes and the desolate look on Alara's face. "You leaving?" he asked gently. Alara couldn't find the words. She simply nodded, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. She turned away, embarrassed, and busied herself with the box on the counter, the one with Marcus's things. The young biker's gaze fell on the army knife she had just set down. He froze. He stepped closer, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Ma'am, may I see that knife?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Confused, Alara pushed it toward him. He picked it up with a reverence that surprised her, turning it over and over in his hands. His thumb traced the carved insignia of the eagle and the lightning bolt. "I don't believe it," he breathed. He looked up at her, his eyes shining with a strange, intense light. "Ma'am, what was your husband's name? His full name?" Marcus Thompson, she said. Why? The young biker shook his head in wonder. My road name is Rook, he said. But the name I was born with is Ben Jr. My father is Grizz. He paused, letting the words sink in. My dad served in this same unit. He talks about it all the time. There was a man in his squad, a Sergeant Thompson. Marcus. My dad said this man saved his life during a firefight in the jungle. Took a piece of shrapnel that was meant for him. They got separated during the evacuation. My dad searched for him for years, but he could never find him. He never knew what happened to the man who saved his life. Alara stared at him, her mind struggling to connect the pieces. Grizz, the big, quiet leader. Marcus had saved his life. The stew, the shelter. She had unknowingly given comfort to the man whose life her husband had saved all those years ago. The world, which had felt so vast and empty, suddenly seemed incredibly small, woven together by invisible threads of fate and memory. Rook looked at her, a fierce sense of purpose hardening his young face. We have to tell my dad, he said, already pulling out his phone. We have to tell Grizz. The noon sun was high and unforgiving, casting harsh shadows across the snow. Just as Mr. Gable had promised, his black car pulled up in front of the diner, followed closely by the Havenwood Sheriff's Department cruiser. Sheriff Peters got out, his face etched with reluctance. He was a decent man trapped in an indecent job, forced to uphold a law that had no room for compassion. Gable, however, looked triumphant. He strode toward the diner with the smug confidence of a vulture circling its prey. A small crowd of townsfolk had gathered across the street, drawn by the scent of drama, their faces a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. Alara met them at the door. She was no longer crying. A strange calm had settled over her. She had her small box of memories in her hands, her dignity her only shield. It's noon, Alara, Gable said, checking his watch with a theatrical flourish. Time's up. Do you have the money? Alara looked him straight in the eye. You know I don't, Mr. Gable. A pity, he said, though his smile suggested otherwise. Sheriff, you may proceed. Sheriff Peters stepped forward, his gaze apologetic.
I'm sorry, Ilare.
Truly, I am. The law is the law. I have to ask you to vacate the premises. She nodded, clutching her box tighter. She would not beg. She would not give Gable the satisfaction of seeing her break. Her integrity was the one thing he couldn't take from her. She had faced down poverty, loneliness, and grief. She would face this too. May I have one last moment to say goodbye to the place? She asked, her voice quiet but steady. Gable scoffed. Don't be ridiculous. Get your things and get out. But the sheriff held up a hand. Let her have a minute, Gable. For goodness sake, show some decency. As Alara turned to take one last look at the diner that held the entirety of her life, a sound began. It was faint at first, a low hum on the edge of hearing, like a distant swarm of bees. It grew steadily, a deep, resonant vibration that seemed to make the air itself tremble. The onlookers murmured, looking down the snow-packed road. Sheriff Peters and Gable turned, their expressions shifting from certainty to confusion. The hum became a roar, a deafening, thunderous roar that echoed off the silent, snow-covered hills. And then they appeared. Over the rise at the end of the street came a single headlight, then two, then 10, then a flood. A river of chrome and black leather poured into Havenwood. It wasn't 20 bikes this time. It was 100. An army. They moved with a disciplined, intimidating grace, filling the street from curb to curb, a phalanx of steel and fire. The iron serpents had returned. They came to a stop in perfect formation, their engines idling in a deep, menacing chorus that drowned out all other sound. The townspeople stared, their mouths agape. Gable's face had gone pale, his smugness evaporating like mist. Sheriff Peters instinctively put his hand on the butt of his pistol, his eyes wide with alarm. The sea of bikers parted, and a single motorcycle rolled forward. It was Grizz. He swung his leg over his bike and dismounted, his boots crunching in the snow. He moved with a slow, deliberate purpose, his eyes, hard as flint, locked on Mr. Gable. He didn't look at Illyria. He didn't look at the sheriff. He walked right up to the small, trembling landlord and stopped, his massive frame blocking out the sun. "You're Gable," Grizz stated, his voice a low growl that carried over the rumble of the engines. Gable swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. I am. This is private property. You have no business here." Grizz ignored him. "I hear you're owed some money." He reached into his leather jacket and pulled out a thick envelope, bulging with cash. "How much does she owe you?" "For back rent." Stunned and intimidated, Gable stammered, $5,600.20. Grizz didn't even blink. He peeled off bills from the thick wad and counted them out with practiced ease, slapping the stack of cash into Gable's trembling hand. "There's 6,000. Keep the change." He then leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Now, how much for the building? How much to buy this diner? Free and clear." Greed warred with fear on Gable's face, and greed won. Seeing a chance to profit from the situation, he puffed out his chest. "It's not for sale." "Everything's for sale," Grizz countered, his eyes narrowing. "Name your price." "Fair one." "I suggest you don't try to swindle me." Gable's mind raced. He saw the 100 bikers watching him, their expressions unreadable but utterly menacing. He saw the pile of cash in his hand. He named a number, an insultingly high figure that was nearly double the building's actual worth. $200,000, he blurted out. A few of the bikers behind Grizz chuckled darkly, but Grizz himself remained impassive. He simply reached into another pocket of his jacket and pulled out a folded document. It was a cashier's check. He handed it to Gable. Gable's eyes nearly popped out of his head. The check was made out to him for exactly $200,000. How did you?" "We have a very good lawyer," Grizz said flatly, "and we came prepared. Sign the deed over." Now, one of the other bikers produced a briefcase, opening it on the hood of Gable's car to reveal a stack of legal documents and a pen. Completely defeated, his bluff called in the most spectacular way imaginable, Gable signed. He snatched the check and scrambled back to his car, not even looking back as he sped away, leaving a cloud of exhaust and shame in his wake. The street fell silent as the 100 engines cut off in perfect unison. In the ringing quiet, Grizz walked over to Illyria, who had watched the entire exchange in a state of stunned disbelief. He took the signed deed from his man and held it out to her. His hard eyes had softened, and in them, she saw a profound, decades-old gratitude. "Ma'am," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Illyria, your husband, Marcus, saved my life a long time ago. I've been looking for a way to repay that debt ever since." He gently pressed the deed into her hands. "This diner is yours now. The hearth belongs to you. No one will ever threaten your home again. This is a debt, long overdue, paid in full." Tears streamed down Illyria's face, not of sorrow, but of overwhelming, unbelievable joy. She looked from the deed in her hand to the face of the man before her, and then to the army of bikers standing silently in her defense. Her world had not ended. It had just been reborn. The townspeople who had gathered to watch a tragedy now stood as witnesses to a miracle. They saw the humbled sheriff offer a quiet, heartfelt apology to Illyria. They saw the fear on their own neighbors' faces curdle into shame, then awe. The story of the cold-hearted landlord and the kind old woman was not the story they had expected. This was something else entirely. This was a story of honor, of a debt repaid across decades, of a quiet act of kindness returned 100-fold. But the iron serpents weren't finished. Their arrival was not just a show of force. It was a mission of restoration. As if on a silent command, the bikers dismounted and began to move, not with menace, but with purpose. One group produced toolkits from their saddlebags and immediately set to work on the diner's flickering sign, their skilled hands rewiring it with expert precision. Another team clambered onto the roof, unrolling tarps and beginning to patch the leaks that had plagued Illyria for years. A large supply truck, which had been waiting at the end of the road, rumbled forward, and the bikers formed a human chain, unloading box after box of fresh food, canned goods and supplies, stocking the empty pantry and refrigerator until they were overflowing. They insulated the drafty walls. They replaced the cracked window panes. They repaired the sputtering furnace until it hummed with a steady, powerful heat that pushed the last of the cold from every corner of the room. They worked with the disciplined efficiency of a military unit, each man knowing his task, their movements a symphony of constructive action. They transformed the hearth from a place of decay and desperation into a beacon of warmth and security. Overwhelmed, Illyria could only watch for a moment before her own instincts took over. She wiped her eyes, tied on her apron, and fired up the grill. With the bounty of food they had brought her, she began to cook. She made pancakes and bacon, brewed pot after pot of strong, hot coffee, her hands moving with a renewed sense of purpose. The diner, which had been silent for so long, was soon filled with the sizzle of cooking, the aroma of fresh coffee, and something it hadn't heard in years: laughter. The bikers, their work done, filled the booths, their intimidating exteriors melting away to reveal men who were gentle and respectful. They ate with hearty appetites, sharing stories with Illyria, asking about Marcus, telling her about their own families. They were no longer strangers. They were family, a found family, forged in the crucible of a snowstorm and bound by a legacy of honor. The people of Havenwood, seeing the warmth and light pouring from the diner's windows, began to emerge from their homes. First one, then another, then a small crowd came forward, not with judgment, but with offerings of pies, with apologies, with offers to help wash dishes. The town's moral compass, long skewed by prejudice and fear, was slowly righting itself, corrected by the undeniable evidence of goodness they had just witnessed. Illyria May Thompson was not just the owner of a diner anymore. She was the heart of Havenwood, and her hearth was finally truly warm. A year passed. The snows of that brutal winter melted, giving way to a vibrant spring, a warm summer, and a crisp, colorful autumn. The hearth diner did not just survive. It thrived. The flickering sign now blazed with a steady, welcoming light, a landmark for weary travelers. The story of Illyria and the Iron Serpents had become a local legend, a modern fable whispered in coffee shops and grocery stores, a reminder that kindness was a currency more valuable than gold. The diner itself was transformed. The walls were adorned with photographs, not just of Marcus, but of Illyria standing proudly with Grizz, of laughing bikers squeezed into booths, of community potlucks held on the newly built patio out back. The hearth became an unofficial sanctuary, a known safe haven for veterans passing through town, for bikers of all clubs, for anyone who felt like an outsider. They knew that within those walls, they would find a hot meal and a warm welcome, no questions asked. Illyria was no longer a woman on the edge of despair. She was a pillar of her community, her quiet strength now a source of inspiration for everyone. With the profits from the bustling diner, she started a small charity, Marcus's Table, which provided free meals for anyone in Havenwood who was struggling. The very town that had been ready to watch her eviction now celebrated her as a hero. The Iron Serpents were regular visitors. At least once a month, a contingent would roll into town, not as a menacing force, but as beloved friends. They would help with repairs, share a meal, and sit for hours listening to Illyria's stories, their presence a constant, reassuring promise that she would never be alone again. One crisp autumn evening, Illyria stood behind the counter, polishing a glass as she watched the last rays of the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. The diner was quiet, the last of the dinner customers having just left. On the counter, next to the register, was a new framed photo. It was taken on the one-year anniversary of that fateful snowstorm. In it, Illyria stood smiling, flanked by Grizz on one side and Sheriff Peters on the other, with 100 proud bikers arrayed behind them. It was a picture of her family, her strange, loud, loyal, wonderful family. She thought of Marcus and the infinite value of kindness. She had offered a simple pot of stew, a moment of warmth against the cold. She never could have known that this single, selfless act would ripple outward, touching so many lives and returning to her with a force so powerful it reshaped her entire world. It was a testament to a simple, profound truth, that the light of one small candle, offered in the deepest darkness, has the power to ignite a fire that can warm the entire world. A deep, abiding peace settled in her soul, as warm and as steady as the gentle hum of the new furnace. Her hearth was full,